Hello YouTubers, apologies if you can hear a fan going on in the background, but my laptop is currently rendering another video, so unfortunately, just have to unfortunately deal with it. Anyway, today I finished listening to Susan's War, which is the latest in the, Time War range, or spin-offs, or whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, and I'm going to say these Big Finish box sets, the Time War ones, don't require you to have listened to the other ones in the range, but it does help. For example, there are characters in this who are established in other Big Finish range box sets that all relate into the Time War. So, as I said, it's not a necessity, but it does just help. I mean, to be honest, even a couple of the characters who I had listened to in other Big Finish box sets, I actually forgot about until being reminded of them here. I just thought they were new characters. But anyway, so thank you, Reese, but not now. So, this essentially, unlike the 8th Doctor at the time, Susan accepts the call to Gallifrey and basically gets involved with the Time War, and it's emphasised her ability to, read minds or communicate with minds. Basically, remember the Sensorites? Well, that ability she had to communicate telepathically, that is very, very heavily emphasised in this, and it's one of the reasons why the Time Lords, recruit her and ask for her to come back and join the war efforts. And none of that, and one of the reasons is so that they can, in the first story at least, they can make the Sensorites an ally. Now, I'm just going to warn you now, I'm going to have to, talk about some spoilers in this, otherwise I can't really review it properly, so there's your warning, so there you go, off you go. So, in the first story of this 4-part box set, and the 4 stories, this time around, aren't actually one big long story. I mean, it's generally they're generally 4 separate stories, with the Time War being an arc in the background. But unlike other Time War box sets where it is literally just 4 parts of one big story, these not so much really. They're very individual stories, but all taking place during the Time War. But anyway, the first story, Sphere of Influence. Now, this sees the return of the Sensorites, but also sees the return of William Russell as Ian Chesterton. And this story continues, it's not really said when it is set, but basically, the Time Lords decide to recruit Ian Chesterton as well, since he was there when they initially encountered the Sensorites. Again, it's just a reason just to basically get Ian into this, and as with the Sarah Jane adventures, and this is confirming that Ian did marry Barbara. We don't actually hear Barbara, but the story actually starts with Ian being on the phone to Barbara. So yeah, it is nice having Carol Langford and William Russell interacting again, since it's not something, that they've done, and also this is the first time we've actually had the two of them, meet up again since Dalek's invasion of Earth. At least from Ian's point of view and Susan's point of view, so that seems logical there, so that's where they are. The Sensorite story is, to be honest, it's a lot like a lot of these Big Finish Time War box sets where, they're trying to ally themselves, the Time Lords are trying to ally themselves with an alien race, in this case the Sensorites. However, they're trying, initially they just try and do it peacefully, but they are prepared to do it by brute force if need be. And the Daleks are sort of in this one, very, very briefly. But it's in this story that the Sensorites are shown to have told that they have the ability to basically mess with the Daleks' minds and essentially cause them to exterminate each other, which is a really interesting idea. And to be honest, I really wish it had gone for that aspect a lot more than what does actually happen in this story, because to be honest, a lot of it feels like a repeat of the Sensorites. We have a Sensorite, trying to purposely sabotage um, things with the rest of the Sensorites, kind of. But the main bulk villain of the story is a Dalek Sensorite hybrid that that is basically able to influence all of the other Sensorites into essentially doing, what the Daleks want, which again is an interesting idea. The problem is it's just not don't they just don't do a lot with it. That is my biggest problem with it. Not a lot is actually done with this concept, which is a shame because I would have really liked them to do a little bit more. But I think the problem is it's when we actually find this out. This is like in the last 10-15 minutes of this first episode, and I kind of feel like this should have been like maybe at the halfway point as opposed to the last quarter, because it just kind of feels as if we are just rushing to run out of time, which is a shame in that case. But overall, I do really enjoy this story, mainly for the interactions between Ian and Susan, or William Russell and Callum Ford. It is really good to see them together again, and especially in this context as well. And Ian, throughout it, doesn't really realise how serious the war is. I mean, he knows the Daleks, he knows how bad they are, but he doesn't seem to have the grasp of how bad the Time War actually is. And unfortunately, this is the one and only story that he appears in this box set. So, for those who are looking forward to possibly, a meeting between Ian and the Eighth Doctor, unfortunately, that does not happen in this story whatsoever, unfortunately. So, sorry there. Anyhow, on to the second story, The Uncertain Shore. To be honest, I can't really remember much about this one. I really can't. The Daleks aren't in this one at all, but it does feature robotized Ogrons. Or Rogons, I think someone calls them. They call them something stupid, and it is acknowledged that it is stupid, but it doesn't stop it from being stupid. Again, this one, there's just not a lot to talk about with this, because the story feels like it's the first part of a bigger story. It doesn't feel like its own story. I said these are all separate stories, but they kind of feel like the first part of a bigger story. They don't really feel like they're a full story in the sense of, right, that's a story that's fulfilled. And Big Finish can do singular hour-long stories with an overall narrative, but with this one, it just feels like the Time Lords are looking for a Dalek spy on this planet, and they end up finding the Dalek spy. Okay, and that Dalek spy was, spoiler alert, a shapeshifter. Okay. There's nothing really about this story, to be honest. It is the most forgettable story out of them. I don't really remember much out of this story whatsoever. I remember listening to it and thinking, Jesus Christ, is this story going to get on? Because we spend a good deal, the first 10 minutes of this story, which, is a fair bit actually. We spend about 10-15 minutes of Susan and this Time Lord, I forget her name, just literally wandering around, sitting around, drinking coffee or tea at this place and just kind of chatting around. It's just not that interesting, unfortunately. which I'm just disappointed with that one. It's just kind of it's there. It feels like a lot of these Big Finish box sets kind of have the story that just kind of feels like filler. And sometimes that is because, they're doing a big 4-part overarching story. But with this one, it's, they don't really have that excuse. Like, the 4 stories is not telling one big 4-hour long story, it's just telling separate stories that happen within the Time War. So it doesn't really have that luxury like some of the others. It's kind of like if you've listened to the Further Adventures of Lucy Miller, those are all, those are separate stories in that box set, but they have an overarching story to them. And this is, the Time War is the overarching story, but there are separate stories within that. So that's basically the best way I can explain that. But to be honest, other than the Ogrons, which is nice to have them return as robotized Ogrons, which actually is established as not making them really any smarter, to be honest. Yeah, there's just not a lot to it. And then the final story, which is one of the big sellers, the second big seller of this, is the return of the 8th Doctor and, reuniting with Susan. And the final story is actually a really interesting one. So, Aspects of War has Susan being tricked by a Dalek duplicate to take this time ring and manage to break through the Earth time lock, and she goes back to 1963, during when the First Doctor has dropped off the hand of Omega, so the First Doctor is still there. In fact, spoiler alert again, that's the last time I'm saying that. They actually use a voice clip of David Bragley. So, yeah, it's from another Big Finish that they did with David Bragley, but they do use a voice clip of David Bragley. So, yeah, David Bragley makes the very brief cameo. He only has one line in this, but they do use it. But her and Susan don't actually meet. Probably in the story, she just sees him in the distance. But the story with this one is that the Daleks trick Susan into going back to 1963 because she believes that if she manages to stop the hand of Omega from destroying Skaro, then that will mean that the Daleks will somehow mean that they won't, start the Time War with the Time Lords. I don't know, she's told that this is one of the reasons why that the Time War started, because of the destruction of Skaro. Okay, I don't know why she believes this, but again, she doesn't really have much of a choice as the instant she takes the time ring. Unfortunately, she just zapped off, so she doesn't have much choice in it. But the fact that she goes along with it is pretty questionable. But then the 8th Doctor, pops into the whole frame, and this is the thing that is, not just a spoiler for this box set, but Susan's story as a whole, because you need the context for it. But this is finally where we have the confrontation over Alex's death, and they actually do talk about it. So yeah, so for those who are unaware, Alex was Susan's son, who was killed by the Daleks into the death. And this is the first time that, at least I'm aware of, and it says so in the special features, that Susan and the 8th Doctor, actually do talk about it. And yeah, it's one of the reasons why they both have sort of different views on things. Susan, thinks that you should fight and you can't just, uphold your personal morals and keep yourself clean and that. And the Doctor at this point in time, is refusing to fighting, seeing that this is not the right thing to do. He'll come to rescue people, who are being killed or having troubles on the battlefield, but he will not be head-on fighting, which is something that obviously changes when he becomes the War Doctor. So yeah, it is interesting that the Daleks send Susan back to try and do this, but then they also manage to remotely robotize, some of the youth there, the biker gang or something, and they manage to try and get the hand of Omega, which actually, if you're listening to it, it's actually a twist that you don't realise, but makes sense in the long run, how the Doctor's able to trick them. And also we get references to Remembrance of the Daleks. For example, some of the renegade Dalek agents who have the robotization chip actually show up as well. The thing is, though, in Remembrance of the Daleks, the renegade Dalek agents were not robotized. It was the Imperial Dalek agents that were robotized that had the chip behind the ear, because the chip behind the ear is actually mentioned. So, because the renegade Daleks didn't actually robotize anyone and didn't actually control anyone, they just managed to convince this man that, that they're doing a good thing that'll put Britain back on the map or whatever. I mean, it was all complete fucking lies, but the fourth story is probably the best story. The first story and the last story, I would say, are the best stories, which is normally with a Big Finish box set. They normally start high and they normally end high as well. So I'd say the first and last stories are the best in the box sets. Paul McGann, as ever, is great as the 8th Doctor, and it is nice to hear, Hurt and Susan interact. Also, so you might hear another Doctor Who related actor in this. I believe it's Peter Davison's son that's in this. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it is, but yeah. And that, would I recommend Susan's War? Well, this is the one I was really looking forward to, and I've got to say, I'm kind of disappointed by it, to be honest. I am pretty disappointed by it. I think part of the problem is it kind of feels like it's holding back quite a bit, because normally these Time War box sets are really brutal, the stakes are really high with everything, and this one, it really isn't, unfortunately. The Daleks, despite being advertised very heavily on the cover, again, are barely in it. I'm sick of Big Finish. I mean, I know why they throw the Daleks on the cover, but literally they chuck the Daleks all over the cover, but they are barely in this. They barely appear. They only appear in a couple of scenes in the first story. They are in the final story a bit more, but not a massive amount. To be honest, the Daleks duplicate does most of the talking. So it is a shame that it is such a small appearance of them, that they are so heavily advertised on it. Yeah. Susan's War, though, did give me everything that I, wanted from it at the same time. The stories were not that interesting, to be honest, apart from the final one that had a few things, but to be honest, the final story was very much playing on nostalgia of An Unearthly Child and Remembrance of the Daleks. It was pretty much playing on nostalgia for that. But for the most, the thing that saves the box set is the character interactions. And I just realised I also completely skipped Wait, no, Aspects of War is not the story that the Eighth Doctor comes in. I've just realised I completely forgot about the fourth and final story. Is the Shoreditch intervention. So I apologise. I just got that wrong. I just realised that. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, I'll quickly talk about Aspects of War, which is the third story, which I haven't actually talked about at all. I accidentally skipped by that one. So apologies for that. So just rewinding back before the final story. So the third story is actually really good, actually. I think as a story that kind of works more. Essentially, the time, these Time Lords on this planet, and this Time Lord scientist has been developing these time-sensitive animals, like dog-like, because I'm assuming since they refer to their kind as pups, so I'm assuming they're dog-like. They snarl and go like dogs or wolves, I guess. And it's about to be honest, it's about a Gallifreyan, a regular Gallifreyan, not a Time Lord, and their involvement in the war and the way that the Time Lords have been treating the Gallifreyans, because the Time Lords essentially have been, risking Gallifreyan lives by trying to turn them into the Time Lords by one described by the person in this, that the character's brother was taken to the schism and forced to look into it, just like we see in Series 3 of Doctor Who. Unfortunately, he doesn't become a Time Lord. In fact, it basically blanks his mind and he just remains like an empty shell of himself. And, yeah. Which is interesting. It's again, it's not the story itself is pretty basic. This character, this Gallifreyan, basically is able to take control of these creatures, and he releases them. And he basically wants to, cause the end of get revenge on the Time Lords who were so horrible to him, and he's about to be taken off to be executed. But Susan decides not to have him executed and instead have him be exiled. And the way it plays out is that, it's an interesting dynamic. Again, I'm just going to talk about the box set as a whole now, in conclusion. This box set, its stories, for the most part, aren't that interesting, the 4 stories. They do have their moments. What really does work, though, is the character interaction, and it's mainly because of Caroline Ford interacting with basically whatever character she is interacting with. She gives it so much more momentum to it. And that's the thing that shines in this. Not the stories themselves. The stories themselves, there's nothing really original about them, and it's just the characters in it, the character interactions in this story are the things that drive it. And if you are a fan of that, then great. But I would say this is a box set, unfortunately, that you could very easily skip. Unfortunately, it's just not a one that really holds much, unless you're a real fan of the Susan character interaction with either the 8th Doctor or Ian, which I am obviously a fan of, and the reason I buy the box set. If you buy it for that purpose and that purpose alone, then you'll be perfectly satisfied, but don't expect anything more from this. It's not an amazing, be-all and end-all box set, unfortunately. I don't know whether it should have had its own box set. I think it would have made more sense rather than give Susan her own box set. Maybe these stories were incorporated into other stories, because it just feels like they had 2 ideas for 2 stories, one with Susan meeting Ian and the Sanctorites again, and one where she meets the 8th Doctor again, and then they kind of just basically out a bit in the middle. I don't know. It kind of feels like this one was rushed, essentially. it does feel like it was rushed, and that's how I feel about a lot of the big finishers. That since they have so many ranges of stories and they're releasing so many things, I just think they're being stretched far, far, far too thinly, unfortunately. And box sets like this, unfortunately, are suffering as a result. Is it bad? No, I wouldn't call it bad. But I just call it very underwhelming. I wouldn't say there's anything great about this story, other, well, this box set, other than the character interactions. So, yeah, and overall, in terms of, linking to the Time War, overall, again, nothing really makes any dramatic differences in this box set, so again, it's an easy skip. So, unfortunately, yeah, that's kind of it for Susan's War. Would I recommend getting it? It's kind of a 50-50, to be honest. If you weren't, if you're not the biggest fan of Susan, then obviously this box is not going to be you. And if you wanted, some interesting Time War stories, again, this box set is not for you. It's basically, do you like the character interaction of Susan and, between Susan and different characters? If you do, then you will, enjoy this box set. Otherwise, no, not really. It's kind of just like your average big finish. And unfortunately, apart from the interactions between Susan and Ian and the Eighth Doctor and Susan, I'm not really going to remember anything else about this story, for better or worse. So anyway, that does it for this review, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.